So now we are live. So I think I'll get us started. I want to welcome everybody here. This is the 5th week of the online portion of the Economic Development Academy. Glad to meet all of you. I've met some of you virtually through the Canvas platform, and I've met some of you in face-to-face in the work in community development across the state. So over the past few weeks, you've been learning a little bit about the Community Capitals Framework. And when I think about the Community Capitals Framework, it's really just a way to think holistically about the things that add to the long-term well-being of a community. And as such, my hope is that throughout this next half an hour or so, that we can make this an interactive discussion. If you have questions that you want to raise as we talk about the framework itself and how it can be applied to your work, please type it in the chat box. I will pause at certain points in the presentation today to allow dialogue and discussion so that we can have some live interaction with that too. So what are community capitals? And so when I think about community capitals, I really think about them as really nothing more than resources that can be invested or tapped for the purpose of promoting community well-being, and in the broader sense. So community well-being can mean jobs, it can mean income, it can be greater safety in a community, it can be social well-being, it can be ecological function, it can mean a lot of different things. And so the community capitals is really a broad framework that's really focused on community health and well-being. And of course, economy and economic development is a piece of it, but it's not the entirety of the community capitals framework. Nonetheless, we thought it was a good framework to start with to sort of help you folks think about your community in a broader sense than just say the built capital or the financial capital that we typically think of when we think about economic development in your community. So again, the reason why we wanted to start with this framework is because we wanted to reinforce the notion that economic development is about a lot more than just trying to recruit business and industry to your town, particularly in rural communities where recruitment is not always the easiest or the best strategy to do that. You know, many of you I know have worked in communities, and as I have, and we often hear leaders in communities saying, if we could just get that manufacturer to move to town, or if we had the resources, we could solve all of our problems. And so the Capitals Framework really helps us to consider all of the types of resources that we can actually leverage to make our communities more vibrant in the long term. So I'm going to actually do a lightning review of a couple of the capitals that we haven't discussed yet. So 3 of the capitals, those are natural capital, financial capital, and political capital. And rather than getting too much in depth about each of those capitals, I'm going to share a little bit of a vignette about how each of those capitals can be leveraged in a community to strengthen the economy and create economic vibrancy. So the first of the capitals, natural capital, really refers to the landscape, the air, the water, the soil, and the biodiversity of plants and animals around us. In other words, it's the amenities, scenic amenities, recreational amenities. It's the products such as maple syrup or wood products, and the ecosystem services like clean water and clean air that the natural environment provides for us. So I think one really good example of how a region has leveraged natural capital is the Kingdom Trails. Many of you may have traveled to the Kingdom Trails region in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. It's a network of actually hundreds of miles of trails that's located in near East Burke, Vermont. It's been in existence for maybe since 1994, so about 20 years or so, a little over 20 years. And the Kingdom Trails really started out as a nonprofit organization whose mission was really conservation at the forefront. They wanted to make sure that the region's assets were preserved and protected for the people of the region, but they also wanted to provide recreational opportunities for the people of that region. I remember traveling to the Kingdom Trails area back in the mid-90s, and it was a pretty small network. It did draw some people, but it took about 15 or so years to take off. And now if you go to East Burke in the summertime, you'll see mountain bikers all over the place. You'll see in the wintertime, you'll see cross-country skiers. And so it's really for active recreation, for non-motorized recreation, and it's become quite a mecca for sports people. We were actually looking at some recent data which talked about the economic impact of the Kingdom Trails. in the 25 or so, 20 or so years that it's been in existence, it's actually grown to have a $12 million annual impact on the regional economy. And it's estimated that around 160 jobs have been created as a result, directly or indirectly, as a result of the Kingdom Trails Network. And so knowing a little bit about the region there, the Northeast Kingdom in Caledonia County in Vermont is in some ways similar to what you would see in northern New Hampshire. You've seen some job losses. You've seen some certain sectors in decline. The forest economy has changed pretty significantly over the years. And so it has a higher unemployment rate than the rest of the region and the rest of the state of Vermont. There are some wealthy people that live in the area, but there also is quite a bit of poverty in the area. But jobs is something that's on the forefront of everybody's mind in the region. And to be able to generate 160 jobs through a trail network like this is not a small feat. So I think it's a good example of how the natural amenities and assets of a region have been leveraged to promote a tourism economy and a recreational economy for people that live there. I guess another example that I like to turn to when I think about natural capital, and it's kind of a classic example of New York City. New York City has developed a system of aqueducts to get its water. Right now, New York City requires about 200 billion gallons of water per year to basically satisfy the drinking and water needs of the city. That's a huge amount of water, and a lot of that water has come from the various watersheds around it, but probably 90% of that water comes from the Delaware River and from the Catskills watershed basin. And those aqueducts were developed starting in the 40s and 50s. Well, around the 1950s, there was a big development boom that was happening in the Catskills, and they were seeing a lot of their waterfront and their riverfront properties get developed. And there was a concern and there was observation that the water quality of the Delaware River and in the watershed area was being degraded pretty quickly. So New York City took some quick action. They enforced some policies to protect the riparian corridor. They put limits on drawing of water. They put a lot of emphasis, and Cooperative Extension, our own organization, had a critical role in helping farmers and landowners protect buffer strips and restore riparian corridors. And so in a fairly short amount of time, they were able to restore and improve the water quality. And that's why New York City is able to get most of its water from that particular watershed. When you think about the costs that would be incurred for trying to treat water from another water source more locally, it would probably be in the millions, if not billions of dollars to be able to treat that amount of water. So for New York City, it's been a huge resource. It's not without contention, because there are other parts of the state that feel that New York City is drawing a vital resource that should be more of a public good. But nonetheless, it's helped New York City quite substantially. Sorry, my slides weren't progressing here. This is just a slide that shows, just depicts some of the types of capitals. You see the recreation, fly fishing, you see the cross-country skiing, the tree farm, farming and kayaking and recreation and clean water. Another capital that I want to talk about briefly is financial capital. And financial capital are essentially the resources that are needed to fund the provision and construction and implementation of pretty much any program, project, or asset that advances the community's well-being, typically related to the built infrastructure. And effective use of financial capital requires the presence of financial institutions in a community foremost. Those could be banks, it could be community development finance institutions, it could be an economic development corporation that makes money available for lending for businesses. But also, sometimes in more rural communities, we also forget about how local wealth can be leveraged. And there are a lot of creative ways that communities can tap into that local wealth. You've probably all heard of Ithaca bucks. Ithaca, New York, has come up with its own currency, a local currency, which it has, in the past, it traded. You could actually buy goods and services and trade with Ithaca bucks. In terms of providing a case study, I think a case study that Sharon Cowan and I often come back to is the case study of Perry, New York. the town of Perry, it's in upstate New York, somewhere west of Utica, I believe. I've never actually been there, but I've seen pictures of the main street, and it looks pretty typical for what you would see in sort of the northern forest region. You have your one main street with most of your businesses concentrated on that main street. You have a hardware store, you have a liquor store, your town hall, and a lot of the post office and such. And now, over the last probably 30 years, the town of Perry has gone through some pretty substantial decline. And a lot of the buildings on the main street have gone into disrepair. It's expensive to upkeep some of those old buildings from the 1800s and early 1900s. A lot of the storefronts in the properties have gone vacant. There's been an outmigration of people from the town, so the population is actually declining. There's a lack of cultural activities. There's no longer a theater in the town or a bowling alley. And the infrastructure, they're having challenges as the tax base gets smaller. It's harder and harder to sustain that infrastructure for the community. So at that time, about 10 years ago, this young architect, his name was Rick Hauser, he moved to the town, and he thought it was a neat place. It had a lot of potential. And as an architect, he could see the potential in the physical infrastructure and the buildings. But he wasn't quite sure how to get there. So he asked the question, who in the region has the long-term interest as well as the capital to invest in Perry to salvage it and to maintain it and rehabilitate the structures? And he looked at banks and financial institutions and USDA rural development, and really it was hard to find any investors who were willing to put any skin in the game and invest in Perry because they saw it as a dying town. But his answer was that the people who live there cared enormously about the town of Perry. They had a very robust volunteer committee of people that wanted to do things from Main Street beautification to a variety of projects to make the town a better place. And they were looking for financing as well. What they didn't think of is, well, perhaps they themselves, the people of the community, could be the financiers to help revitalize the downtown. And so Rick Hauser created this financial mechanism that he called Main Street LLC. Much like you would invest in a limited liability corporation, he created a financial structure where anybody in the community could invest in a building, or in his case, it was 7 buildings in the downtown that he assumed control of through the LLC, and they allowed people to invest and buy a share of those buildings. Now, those buildings could end up being a residence, or they could end up being a business, but what it gave people the opportunity was to buy a share of that enterprise, and also a share of the profits. But as part of the trade-off, because it's hard to be able to generate capital, especially if people are moving in and out, they had to make a commitment for a certain number of years to be able to invest in that community. And there's a risk too, because the enterprise is not guaranteed that it would succeed. But part because of Rick Hauser's charisma, but also in part because of the creative financial mechanism that he created, he was able to generate enough capital within a fairly short period of time to be able to renovate those 7 buildings on the main street. And the old expression, when you fix a broken window in the neighborhood, the rest of the town starts to come along. And so Perry has actually gone through a pretty significant transformation. It's not out of the woods yet. It still has its issues and its problems, but it's on an upward trajectory, and it's a lot more desirable place with a higher quality of life than it was a decade ago. So. And I see someone here made a comment that they did this exact same thing in Sunapee. So, Derek pointed out that this is essentially crowdsourcing solution for investment. In essence, yes, this is a crowdsourcing solution for investment, because you're asking the community if they're willing to put, as Rick Hauser used to say, are you willing to put your money where your house is? And if so, here's a mechanism by which you can do that, and you can have part ownership of the future of the community. So I'm going to take a quick pause and see if anyone else wants to share any stories or examples of how either natural capital or financial capital have been leveraged by a community. So if you're welcome to unmute yourself and share a story if you have anything you'd like to share. So.
This is Julie Glossner. I'm with the Small Business Development Center out of UNH Manchester, and Franklin is actually starting to do that.
Yeah. Do you want to say more about Franklin in terms of what's happening there?
So they're working as a group. There's a few of them that come together to, they're trying to get biking trails, more of them. There are some, and they're trying to link them together, and they're working with the state with that. They are renovating buildings that they've purchased. They're trying to get restaurants in there. There is a whitewater rafting company trying to, that is in business and just trying to promote that area for that as well. Mm-hmm. So it reminded me of what you just were talking about in Perry. Yeah. I do think it's going to take some time.
Yeah. It's interesting that when I think about Franklin, Cooperative Extension helped, they worked with Franklin. Sharon Cowan actually led a project there a few years ago called Franklin for a Lifetime, where we asked them to envision what their ideal future would be. And we brought funders and resource people to the table. And it really generated a lot of energy in the community about what the community could be. And we did a design charrette along with that. And with the design charrette, they created renditions of what the waterfront could look like, how those old mill spaces could look, and opportunities to take adaptive reuse of old mill buildings to turn them into housing for seniors and others. And, it's only been a few years since that process, and we're not taking credit for it. I think we were just one of the impeti for making all of that stuff happen. But it's been exciting. Several new businesses have come in town. There's a new coffee shop. They have that new kayak store. They have the potential to become a national kayak center if they can figure out how to get a steady water supply from the dam, which would be negotiating with whatever agency controls the water flow in the dam. So there's some really cool stuff, and they have a property owner, Todd Workman, who's really passionate about making the downtown a place where people can bump elbows. So some really cool stuff happening there. They got a grant and some financing from Catch Neighborhood Housing to put in a number of units of affordable workforce housing. So Franklin is on the rise, definitely. It has a ways to go, but it sees its potential, and it's taking advantage of the assets that it has. So it's a great example. Thank you, Julie. Other examples of how a community has leveraged either natural capital or financial capital?
Charlie, Derek, I think, is asking, this is Penny Whitman, asking about Sunapee and what happened there. I'm just learning more about this, but it's a similar project. I think it happened in 1991. A group of community leaders realized that key buildings in the downtown were looking very shabby, and some were abandoned. Mm-hmm. And so they formed the Sunapee Harbor Riverway, which was a actually for-profit corporation. And they sold shares to the community for those 7 buildings. Mm. And they raised funds. They purchased the properties. Mm-hmm. They renovated the properties. And then they created a community space right in the harbor, where they have music performances and community events. So they're in an interesting place now, from what I understand. They finished that project, and yet they still exist, and they're trying to figure out what to do next. Mm. So it's an interesting case study, because they kind of achieved their goal, but they're still together, and they're trying to figure out what their role is next.
Mm. That I think 2 of you have mentioned this, but that case is very similar to Perry, New York. They created a similar financial mechanism to allow the people to invest back in the community. But I think Perry, New York is also in the same position, that they have rehabbed a large chunk of the buildings that needed work on the main street in the downtown. The rest of the buildings kind of fixed themselves as people saw the opportunity and invested in them. So now they're trying to figure out what to do. But I guess it just goes to show you that when you have creativity and passion and will in a community, that you can find a way to get things done and raise the capital to make something happen. So, anyone else willing to share a story about how a community has leveraged a capital?
Yeah, this is Laura Tavares. So I live in Lowell, Massachusetts, which has not only the Merrimack River, which I know flows through a few of the other communities in New Hampshire that a few folks in this group are part of, but also the canal system. first and foremost, the utilization of the canals and the mill buildings in the establishment of the National Historical Park in, I think it was the 70s. It was way before I was here. And continue to do more around the canals and drawing attention to them and the history that's here as well in terms of the natural capital, and both hosting events as well as, so events in terms of festivals, we'd like to party, and as well as educational events. About 2 years ago, they started a series called Lowell Walks, which is every Saturday morning, folks meet at the National Park Visitor Center. It's not a program at the National Park. It was started by Dick Howe, who's our Register of Deeds and also seen as one of the local historians. And there's somebody that leads the walk around the town on a different topic. So we had one on abolitionism and the role of Lowell. There was a public art walk, so walking around to all the different public art and talking about what it symbolizes, how it got there, why it's there. Walks on specific parts of the canal system, because so many of us see the canals and know the canals, but don't necessarily know how they connect or how they were originally utilized and the importance it was for industry.
That's a cool story, because it seems like what you're describing, the city has been able to leverage both the cultural capital of Lowell, the history and heritage of the mills, but also the social capital by creating events and opportunities for people to come together in the downtown to learn and to bump elbows. Yeah. In our work in communities, when you try and come up with a metric of what a vibrant community looks like, you can talk about it in economic terms, but really, you know it when you see it. It's when you have a lot of people, when you see people on the street, there's opportunities for them to mingle, to chatter, to do things outside, and it's the ability to bump elbows for me is what I see as a vibrant. So, any other examples before we move on to the next capital? All right. I'll open it up again in the end for other input too. So the last capital that I want to talk about today, because I think you've pretty much covered the others throughout, is political capital. And political capital is really the ability to affect the distribution of public and private resources within the community. As some people say, it's the ability to get things done. To gain access to organizations or the power brokers, it's influencing important decisions, it's efforts to develop new leadership in the community, and engaging the public in that decision-making process. Those are all elements of political capital. And I have a story. I'm going to have to keep the name of the community hidden and absconded. But there is a town that we worked with, Cooperative Extension worked with in New Hampshire, that had a very engaged community. A number of people wanted to see positive change happening, but they felt like the select board was had vested interests, financial interests in development, and were sort of controlling the destiny of the community, but not in line with what the community wanted to see, and nor was it in line with what the master plan stated. So the community came together. We did a visioning forum. We had around 300 people turn out to this visioning forum. And on one hand, they talked about the great potential of the community. And on the other hand, they talked about their frustration that the people in entrenched leadership positions were really not allowing the vision that they had to come forth. And in fact, they felt that the select board and other municipal bodies were instrumental in really speeding up the pace of development in the community, which was destroying some of the natural capital that they really relied on, not only for their scenic and natural and recreational amenities, but for a lot of other things. So out of this forum, a group of action committees formed, and one of those action committees set as its task to run for political office. And this action committee had 5 people on it, and when the next election came around, they all got elected to political office, and they began to institute some of the changes that came through during this visioning forum. And the former select board was really pretty vociferously voted out of town because they did not do a good job at engaging the broader community in helping to craft the vision and how that vision was going to be articulated and carried forward in the community. So it's an example of how a group of people who care about something can come together and they can actually change the politics at the local level and make it more community oriented. So, all right, so we have covered our 3 political capitals. Does anyone have a story they'd care to share about political capital, or for that matter, any of the other capitals that we talked about?
Charlie, this is Sharon. Shannon Rogers texted in the chat box that her mic doesn't seem to be working, but she had a couple of examples of issues in Providence.
Okay.
The links are there in the chat box.
Yep, so water fire and river fire, right? Those are 2 events that I guess I can't speak to them in great detail. Does anyone else know about water fire and river fire?
It's about using rivers for economic and community development, she said.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Cool.
Oh, and then there's another one. Someone put in the chat box the river fire. There's one on Facebook that someone is involved with.
Mm-hmm.
Who is LST? I'm not sure who that is. Can you speak to that?
That's me. It's Laura Scarlett Tavares.
Oh, thank you, Laura.
we use Zoom and Interrise, and we have multiple Lauras that work here, so I'm known by LST.
Oh,
so.
got it. All right. Well, you want to talk about that one?
Sure. So it's the Points of Light Lantern Celebration that started for the first time last year. And actually, I feel like this whole, how this all started is sort of a very interesting case study. So friends of mine started an organization called DIY Lowell, which is Do It Yourself Lowell. And the whole point is there's a series, a time in which people submit ideas to make Lowell a better and more vibrant community. Then they shut off the idea generation and there's a voting period. And while people are voting for what their favorite ideas are, they have to commit to something. So they have to commit to either donating to DIY Lowell or commit to coming to their summit or working on an event. And then the top 4 ideas are brought forth at their ideas summit, and working groups come together around those ideas. So someone submitted this idea of doing floating, those floating lanterns that you can personalize down one of the canals. And I was at the summit and I joined this group because it was one of the smaller groups and ended up being a part of the planning, and still am. We're getting ready to do our second event. We've working on, actually just submitted a grant report, proposal for it yesterday. And so again, it was utilizing the natural resources in terms of one of the canals. We chose a canal, it's called the Western Canal, and there was a space called Ecumenical Plaza that is between 2 churches in the Acre neighborhood of Lowell, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods. And it was put together as a space where people could come together and convene, but it was never utilized that way. So this was one of the first big events. And we floated about 850 of these lanterns down the canal. And what I thought was most interesting about it was, in terms of access points of getting them in and out of the canal, we probably picked the worst spot to do this because there is no access point. There's no way to get a boat down there. So we had to build a ramp. I was on the edge of the canal fishing them out at the end of the night. But to us, it was really important to be in that neighborhood and be in that space because we were able to work with the Lowell Housing Authority and their residents to bring them out, and just us being in that place. You know, all the residents who live nearby were just coming out like, what the heck is going on? So it was pretty cool. It was very well received, and we had over 1,000 people there for the first one, which happened in April, and we're gearing up for year 2.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. So, any other examples that you want to share? So I guess I want to wrap up by just reiterating that the community capitals framework is really just as simple as reminding us that a vibrant community relies on a lot of different attributes to make it vibrant. And it's really about seeking to find a balance. And I think what that balance is may depend on that particular community. And in our work as practitioners, we often draw from models, whether it's the community capitals framework, which is really thinking about the resources that you have within your community that you can tap into. Appreciative inquiry is another approach that you've been exposed to. That's not a framework that I'm particularly familiar with, but it's also another asset-based approach. And then there's always going back to the 1960s and the progressive period and the LBJ period, sort of the needs-based community development approach. That a lot of the programs and initiatives during that period were really focused on addressing key needs. So I think the lesson is that there's no single model that's going to answer all your questions. It's just a simple framework to sort of, it's one way of viewing the world. And in fact, if I had to critique the community capitals model, that one critique would be that if you only focused on the assets that a community has, you probably could be missing some important things that need to be addressed. But by the same token, that's what the progressive period policies were criticized on, is that they focus so much on the problems, the glass half empty, that they never recognized some of the assets that communities had within them to solve some of the problems. So I think, again, it's about balance. One of the reasons why we use models in community development is because many of these models are field tested. They have data and research that supports how effective they are and how well they've been used. And with the community capitals framework, I can speak to that, is there is some pretty significant research that suggests that a healthy community, when you think about it economically, socially, or physically, does have a balance of capitals in it, and that communities that tend to lean towards one particular capital, such as built capital, tend to get out of balance and have a whole suite of problems associated with it. So we kind of threw that out there as a way to just sort of get you grounded. I enjoyed reading the blogs and the discussion around it. I think part of this was intended to get you talking and to get you thinking more broadly about community. I think we have covered the capitals, but I want to open it up for broader general discussion. Either if you want to share other examples of how capitals have been leveraged in your community or in your region, or if you want to talk about maybe your critique or how helpful you think these models are to you in your work. So I'm going to kind of open it up. We don't have to, we can go as long as folks want to talk, but I'd love to hear from folks on, I guess I'd start with, how useful do you find the community capitals framework? Anyone care to field that question? As a teacher, I don't mind the uncomfortable silence. So,
hey, Charlie, this Derek Ferland. I'll have a go. I really like the model because I think it's pretty comprehensive, and it does. The majority of capitals deal with people. So if you look at political, social, human, and cultural, those are all people-based things. And so I think that's pretty important to remember, because it's not just the things that you have in terms of what's built or natural, and the money that you want to bring, because that's kind of like, money does make the world go round. But at the end of the day, it's the other four things that are people-based that are going to sustain the development activities. And I think that's kind of the foundation of everything is always people when you look at any sort of strategic planning endeavor. So that's what I really like about it. And it digs into the four levels of nuance, I guess, for lack of a better term, of what it is about people and how we're connected and how we leverage those things to actually create things. So pretty cool.
Oh, thank you. Our colleague Molly Donovan from Cooperative Extension always has a great story that she shares. She oftentimes will go into a community to assist them with some sort of economic development planning or visioning. And oftentimes the first conversation is, yeah, we've got so many problems in this community. If only we had resources, we could solve those problems. And so Molly does her little hypothetical thing. She says, all right, here's a bag of $5 million. What are you going to do with it? And the answer is often, well, I don't know. And Molly's response is, your problem isn't resources and money. Your problem is lack of vision. It's lack of leadership. It's lack of the human and the people and the political capital to even get that vision created. So the resources will follow if you have a good vision and you have all the other capitals in place. It's not always easy, but resources in some manner will follow.
This is Fran Newton. So I'd like to share what's going on in Ashland. We're just beginning on this journey toward revitalizing our community. And I have found this whole model very helpful to me in terms of generating enthusiasm. We tend to get bogged down in, ain't it awful? And it used to be like this, but it's not anymore. And we don't have enough money and you don't have enough people. And yet I've always thought that the town that I chose 12 years ago was a jewel waiting to be discovered. So I'm finding that I'm getting more and more ideas about directions we can go to generate new excitement. We've had a little bit of it happen. We started a community garden a few years ago because we got a grant from Healthy Eating Active Living in New Hampshire. And we got people together to find out what it is they wanted to do to create one system that was sustainable. And they came up with a community garden. And it grew, and we got a lot of people to participate in the garden, and it's been very, very successful. We've gotten subsequent grants to expand it, to put up fences and so forth. So that was a really good experience. So I know it can be done. Now we're faced with really having to focus on economic development because our tax rate is so high. So we're working very hard at looking at the mill that people didn't want to think about. It was too much of a problem. We don't know what to do with it. And now we've got some political capital in terms of having a group that is determined to find the pathway. And it's opening up for us. We got grants for phase 2 brownfield studies. That's going to help us tremendously. We're getting all the mill owners. It was divided up and sold off when the mill closed. And so we're getting the mill owners coming together for their own common benefit. So for the first time in a long time, I'm beginning to feel positive. And I think that this positive outlook with looking at your capitals instead of ain't it awful, it is really helpful to my thinking. And hopefully we can spread it a little more.
Frances, that's a great story. And I'm thinking back about your discussion about the community garden. A lot of my own research has been on the impacts that community gardens can have on the surrounding community. And we often don't think of this, but not only are community gardens an excellent way to teach young people about the value of food, where it comes from, and getting them more connected to the food system, but community gardens are also microcosms where entrepreneurship happens. And it's where young people and all people can learn how to generate an enterprise. And it might start out with a small thing such as selling canned chili peppers or something like that. But in the city of Boston, a lot of the ethnic gardens, a lot of the gardeners begin micro enterprises out of their community garden. And we know with entrepreneurship, you're never successful, or you're not typically successful on your first venture, but it's this idea of spin. You have to cycle through that process multiple times before you can sort of learn the skills of becoming an entrepreneur. And so a community garden can be that microcosm where you can develop some of these other capitals and these skill sets. So thanks for sharing that. Other folks want to chime in either about the framework, the community capitals framework itself. Helpful, not helpful? How would you use it?
This is Julie Glossner again. I like how you said it's a broader use of not just economic development, but incorporating a lot of other things into it. Because I think that you're right that there is a lot of things that can be brought into an area, and then having a good plan, and then being optimistic as opposed to, thinking of all the negative stuff. So I think overall it's been a good use.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to chime in? Well, if there are no further questions, Sharon, I might have you talk about the next the next module for week 6 for the online component. But I look forward to seeing all of you on November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in Manchester. We've got some great speakers and panelists lined up. And on that first day, November 1st, we're going to end up at it's Millie's Tavern, or what it was formerly called Millie's Tavern. And have some meet and greet and social time there. So I look forward to getting to know all of you better. So Sharon, would you mind sort of giving a brief book?
Thanks, Charlie. So we're pretty much done with talking about the capitals. And the next module will offer you 2 tools that we have seen used in communities. One is the Headwaters report, which is an online system for generating demographic and other information about your community or whatever geographic area you choose. And there's actually just some brief information and an ability to get online and access a report as preparation for the face-to-face session 1, where Charlie will talk about that in more depth. And the second part of module 2 will be about community engagement. And Molly Donovan, our colleague that Charlie just mentioned, will be coming in on day 2 of the face-to-face to also talk more in depth about engagement. But just as preparation for the face-to-face sessions, we're kind of giving you this opportunity to read over and look at some materials to get ready for that. And so I've noticed that some folks are having some issues posting their project ideas. So if you're just having a little bit of trouble getting started on that, that's fine. But if you're really struggling with what to do for your project or issue, and you want just to bounce ideas off of either Bill or I. Bill is at a conference this week that he's actually staffing, so I'm the better resource this week. So if you need some input or discussion or just to connect with one of us, email me, and I'm even happy to talk on the phone if that would be more helpful. So again, we have 1 online module left, and then we will move to the face-to-face. It's hard to believe this time's gone so quickly, but we have just one more module left after this one. So thanks, Charlie.
All right. Well, thank you all. It was nice connecting with you virtually today, and I'll see you face-to-face in a few weeks. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
I will post this to the Canvas site once I download it.
Okay.
Turn it into a video file. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.